Future Warrior, The Mars Campaign. Chapter 15. Pierce sat heavily in the comfortable leather chain opposite General De Vere's, shock of the last few hours' events still numbing. De Vere's having to stand his own chair up before sitting in it. De Vere's office barely resembled the carefully organized world it had been previously. The contents of the tabletop were scattered across the floor, the communications terminal was torn out, and here and there flecks of blood were visible. "Have you ever been pistol-whipped, Pierce?" "I can't say I have, sir." De Vere's grunted. It's surprisingly effective at producing a loss of motor functions and putting an opponent temporarily out of the picture. Pierce nodded, not comprehending or caring for the conversation. "You lost your wife today. Loss changes a man." Pierce nodded, liking even less where the conversation was turning. "Yes, sir, and I feel like my purpose for living went with her." De Vere's looked off into the distance for a long moment before speaking. "You have a new reason, specialist, the purest of reasons, a reason we share, vengeance. You know your wife died, but you don't know how or why." Pierce stared blankly, not understanding. "I lost my son today. He is as dead to me as your wife is to you. But unlike you, wife, he still draws breath, something you're going to help me fix." Pierce sat forward, his concentration returning sharply. "It was my son. He killed your wife and the assault teams. He organized the explosion on the bridge. He was behind Lazarus. He was the rotten core at the heart of everything." Pierce listened as De Vere's explained in detail the discovery of a traitor in the fleet, how the source had helped the Red Legion, and how that source had been revealed to be General De Vere's only son. De Vere's paused to pour himself and Pierce a glass of vintage bourbon whiskey before continuing. "We have both been betrayed and paid a high price for that betrayal. I have made you my new adjutant because I know I can trust your loyalty completely, and because the truth of this must never be known. As far as anyone knows, Atlas is dead, another victim of a Red Legion plot, and that is how it must stay. If word of this gets out, it could ruin the intelligence branch. Our position in the UEL High Council would be critically weakened. We would be mired in scandal at the time we are needed the most." De Vere's paused and placed his glass on the table, the contents drained. "I approve your clearance to Alpha Sirius level myself 2 years ago. You are one of the few who know the full truth of the threats we face. We have made mistakes. I have made mistakes. They must never, ever happen again. My son is a threat to UEL security. As my adjutant, he had access to almost everything." De Vere's took a slow, deep breath, an unmovable determination entering his voice. "If it takes the lives of 1,000 innocents and costs as much as a battleship, we must find and kill him." The bedraggled group moved in silence. The dawn was breaking, and they could just see the dark smudge of smoke from the burning mech and crop on the horizon behind them. The detours they had taken around the main roads and possible enemy fallback routes had added several kilometers to the return journey. Stalker guessed that they must be within 10 to 15 kilometers of the Immortal's position. Stalker glanced ahead at the others. Link was some distance up in front, and Zed was supporting Zoe in the center. 0630. Stalker did a quick calculation in his mind. At this rate, they should, any more enemy contact aside, be back in another few hours. Stalker still dared not use the TACnet to try to contact the Immortal's positions. The threat of enemy detection was still too high. They were finally coming out of the crops and were back into the more familiar red rocky terrain, their path skirting the edge of the plateau, its towering image dominating the landscape. The ground was broken and uneven and was dissected by small mobile dunes. Out in front, Link paused as his HUD lit up with distant movement indicators. Movement left, as one they crouched low and slipped into a depression on the opposite side of a small dune they had been walking along. Stalker moved up past Zoe and Zed. "Hold position and keep low. Link, I'm coming to you." Link had pushed some sand apart in the dune and looked half buried as Stalker slid in alongside him. "What you got?" "Armored vehicles and mecha, still quite distant, but angling this way. Ours or theirs? I'm guessing theirs. I doubt they spotted us from this distance. More likely they're falling back this way and will pass us by." Understood. We have pretty good concealment here. We will lay up and let them pass. While Link kept an eye on the approaching force, Stalker filled the others in, and they piled up a little more concealment around themselves. Stalker positioned himself close to Link and piled up some nearby rocks in front and around himself, breaking up his profile in the slight chance anyone took a closer look in their direction. It was soon apparent, however, that the precautions were not needed. As the vehicles got closer, Stalker could see that they were indeed Reds. It was also clear they were falling back in disarray. The Red Legion forces moved without any clear order or formation, and upon reaching the borders of the broken ground swung parallel to the hidden group's position. Stalker could see that many of the vehicles bore signs of damage. Tanks had jammed turrets. One even had no turret. APCs and IFVs bore similar signs of combat, some so full of holes from cannon fire that Stalker was quietly amazed that they were still drivable. Stalker and the others watched as hundreds of vehicles, soldiers, and the occasional mech streamed past. Then after 10 minutes, the stream began to thin and fizzle out. Without warning, a volley of missiles passed low overhead and plowed into the last of the passing column. There were explosions and scattered weapons fire in all directions, and what little order there was broke down into anarchy. Stalker glanced back over his shoulder, but couldn't see where the missiles were coming from. But at least 20 flashed overhead to sow destruction amongst the retreating Red forces. Link grabbed Stalker's arm and pointed in the distance in the opposite direction the missiles had come from. On the horizon were 4 silver specks closing at high speed. Stalker recognized the sleek profile of fighter bombers immediately. Incoming ordnance. Everybody down. With a flash and ground-shaking sonic boom, the jets passed overhead at low altitude, dropping dozens of small canisters as they did. Explosions rippled through the tail of the enemy column as hail of superheated fragments designed to penetrate armor and flesh were thrown in all directions. Even at the distance he was away from the detonations, Stalker heard lethal projectiles ricocheting off the ground close by, and he hugged the ground tighter. Some ragged tracers chased the jets, but they were already long gone, pushing Mach 2 as they climbed on full power, now free of the weight of their bomb loads. When the smoke and dust cleared, it revealed a scene that was the very picture of destruction. Burning vehicles lay scattered along the path of the retreat. Around them were twisted, broken, and burning bodies. Nothing moved. The retreating force had passed, and only death remained in its wake. Stalker was just about to move when Link stopped him. Following Link's gaze, Stalker saw a formation of 12 Predator gunships sweeping in from behind them, so that's who fired the missiles. Stalker got up and raised his rifle up in one hand. UEDF gunships check fire, friendlies, danger close at your 12 o'clock. As Stalker watched, the formation reacted with the grace of a flock of birds. It split into 3 parts each of 4 gunships. One group came straight on while the other 2 went left and right, sweeping over the battlefield. This is Mongoose 2-4, identify yourself. And no sudden moves, buddy. Stalker motioned the others to get up slowly as the 4 gunships came to halt in a staggered line in front of him. Stalker noticed that the chin cannons on 2 of the gunships followed them closely, while the other 2 swept back and forth looking for any surprises. Friendlies, authenticate 69er86 Tango November. Recon group, we have wounded personnel and men down in the field. Request extraction to safe zone. Roger, all received and verified Tango November. Request passed on. Wait 1. For the first time in days, Stalker let himself relax. Despite the cannons of the gunships still tracking him, he felt a weight come off his shoulders. They were going to be all right. Tango November ground units are en route this location. Hold tight. The hovering gunships pivoted and then swept off in pursuit of the enemy, leaving silence and empty skies in their wake. 20 minutes later, a broad line of tanks swept across the plain towards them. There must have been a whole division, Stalker thought. The scores of tanks were followed by hundreds of other armored vehicles of every conceivable type. The tanks rolled to a halt, and an Ironhide IFV stopped close by, an armored cavalry officer emerging with 2 aides at his back. The officer striding purposefully over to where the small group were gathered. Stalker stood a little straighter when saw the man was a brigadier, the others doing likewise. The officer stopped short. He had a slightly taken-back expression. It was then Stalker considered what a sight they must make. He was burnt, much of his suit badly charred. Zed was helmetless and covered in dried blood from head to foot, and was supporting a wounded and blood-caked Zoe. Link stood relaxed, his eliminator held casually in one arm. Added to this image was a considerable amount of sweat and dust. They must have looked quite bedraggled indeed, Stalker thought. "Glad to see you here, sir." Stalker threw a quick salute, which the officer returned automatically. "You look like hell, Commander. A vehicle is ready to take you to the rear." He motioned to one of his aides who called forward a warthog on his comm. Stalker was about to thank the officer when he had a sudden thought. "With respect, sir, I have men down in the field. I request to accompany the advance and retrieve their bodies before returning." "That goes for us too," chimed in Link. The officer's hard expression softened slightly. "Very well, Commander. I understand completely. There's room in my transport. Mount up." Stalker's respect for the man went up a notch. Stalker knew how dirty and smelly they must have been, yet the brigadier hadn't balked for a moment before offering them a ride in his personal Ironhide. Stalker and the other Terra Nova men jumped into the Ironhide, while Zoe went in a medical warthog to get checked over. As they got underway in the cramped Ironhide, Stalker looked at the brigadier in curiosity. The name under his insignia read Brigadier Sukbatar. "That's an interesting name, sir. Where are you originally from?" The brigadier broke into a wolfish smile, exposing his perfectly white teeth. "I'm from Mongolia, Specialist, and the name means the hero of the axe. My family once rode with Chinggis Khan. Now I ride with the 7th Cavalry." Stalker and the others were suitably impressed. Sukbatar. Stalker rolled the name over in his head. He wouldn't forget the name. They accompanied the 7th Armored Cavalry Division as it swept on like a giant wedge over the fields, flights of Predators and F-55s keeping a watchful eye overhead. They reached the site of the destroyed mech, and with the division watching the Terra and Nova men retrieve their fallen. First Chronic, then Trojan, who they found in a field close to the OP, rifle still clutched in his hand. Next, they moved on until they reached the crash site and recovered the dead and wounded at the LTTS, a Predator locating the missing man's body several kilometers away. The man's wounds showing that he had gone for help, but had been ambushed by a Red Legion mech, possibly the same one that attacked the rescue team during the night. Stalker saw respect in the eyes of the tankers and cavalrymen as the last body was loaded into a waiting warthog. They had seen the battle the assault troops had fought, how far they had traveled, and why. As Stalker closed the warthog's rear hatch and, accompanied by Zed and Link, began walking back to join Zoe for the ride to the rear, the men of the division showed their appreciation. A familiar voice came across the commnet. 7th Cavalry, present arms. Stalker and the others looked up in surprise and saw that everyone, including Brigadier, was saluting them. Overhead, a flight of Predators passed, one peeling off in the missing man formation, the aircraft representing their lost comrades. The group of normally shy men were taken aback by the show of praise and paused before returning the salute. The cavalrymen and tankers broke in applause and calls, and Stalker remembered why he loved his job. Moving on, Stalker, Link, and Zed stopped to shake hands with many of the soldiers and wave to others. It was a moment none of them would ever forget. Bumping around in the warthog, they were all quiet. Stalker looked across at the others. Link was sleeping while Zed was seemingly fascinated by something on his boot. Zoe, however, was looking much better now, with a clean face, hair, and bandages. She was looking at him, holding his gaze. He wondered what she was thinking as they sat there and stared at each other in silence. After transferring to an LTT a few kilometers behind the advance, they were lifted back to a FOB, flying over the Immortals' position on the way. The firebase was even more of a shambles, and from the air, Stalker could see a ring of burnt-out enemy vehicles around it like litter that had fallen from a bin. As they flew low over the firebase, Stalker saw the survivors gathered around medical vehicles and swarming UEDF personnel. There were considerably fewer of the dark gray armored warriors than there had been before. After catching a few minutes of much-needed sleep on the flight, they arrived at a FOB in the rear area designated FOB Hellion. Their arrival was followed by medical checks and debriefings that seemed to go on forever. Stalker then had to record a verbal after-action report before finally being let off the hook. Stepping outside the base command and control building, he stifled a yawn. He had been given permission for 72 hours rest and relaxation on base. Stalker needed the sleep, but first there was one thing he had to do. A few minutes later, after going past his assigned HAB to finally get cleaned up, he strolled into the brightly lit medical wing of the base infirmary. A stern-looking military nurse looked up from her desk and charts. "Can I help you?" "No commander or specialist, I guess." "Yes, madam. I'm here to see Pilot Officer Lassiter." Her expression, already like granite, hardened still further. "I've already turned away 2 of you in the past hour. She needs her rest. You can't just barge in here whenever you want and disturb my patients. You a friend or family member?" Stalker noted the words carried a heavy note of sarcasm. "I'm not in the mood for this shit. It's unit commander or specialist to you, ma'am. And I lost 2 of my men saving her life. So kindly tell me where she is before I decide to talk to your CO on my way out." The nurse's face wilted under his stern gaze, and looking away, she quickly rifled through her patient's status list. Stalker hated pulling rank, but after all the action he had seen, he was damned if he was going to take any crap from someone who had never even faced the enemy. She soon found the room details, and a moment later he strode through the hallways and turned into room D19, recovery ward, and quietly opened the door. Stalker was glad that his quiet word with the medic on the LTT had paid off. Zoe had been allocated a private room. Stalker saw she was sleeping, and he quietly sat in a chair beside her bed, his aching legs grateful for the reprieve. As he sat, Stalker watched Zoe for a moment. She looked serene. Her face and hair were clean now, and her skin a perfect white, only broken by small scratches and scuff marks. Stalker decided he wouldn't wake her, so he settled down in the chair, and before you could count to 10 was fast asleep, his exhaustion finally overwhelming him. Stalker's eyes flickered slowly open. All was quiet. The only noise was the sound of footsteps from a passing nurse outside in the hallway. He stretched and looked across at Zoe. She was lying on her side looking at him, a small smile and an expression he couldn't quite fathom on her face. Stalker returned the smile. "Good morning, Pilot Officer Lassiter." "Good morning, Unit Commander. To what do I owe this pleasure?" she replied with mock formality before breaking into a smile. "Just thought I would stop in and see how the Air Force lives. Nice place you got here." Her smile broadened. "You had something to do with this, didn't you? I know a guy who knows a guy. How do you feel?" "Sleep, okay." Her expression changed, dropping a little. "I slept okay." "Don't worry, girlie. The dreams pass. Trust me, I know." She reached out her hand, and he took it. It was warm. "Thanks again for coming for me. Didn't I tell you, rescuing damsels in distress is my specialty." The door opened, and a nurse came in, looking more than slightly surprised to see Stalker. "Excuse me, sir. You'll have to wait outside while I attend to Miss Lassiter. I had better be going anyway. I'll come back later. You rest up and get your strength back." Stalker stepped out with a last look over his shoulder as he did, seeing Zoe's blue eyes watching him leave. Stalker woke up and looked at the time. It was 1300 hours. Damn, 1 in the Arvo already. He had not slept so long in weeks. "War will do that to you, old man," he mused. Stretching, he got dressed and headed off to get some chow, then went for a jog around the base, his tortured body fighting him every step of the way. Stalker had been off duty for almost 24 hours and had slept almost all of it, and already he was getting bored. Stalker checked in with medical and got the duty nurse to promise to call him later tonight, when Zoe was due to be discharged. Stalker then spent a few slow hours cleaning and testing his kit. Much of it was ruined, and he then dropped it off to a very unimpressed-looking armorer who promptly informed him that replacement kit would have to be brought in from orbit. Stalker spent another hour chatting to some of the men working supply in the base freight terminal, the guys who knew all the latest news and rumors. Stalker's comm beeped. It was an invite to have a beer with Link. Stalker texted him back. "Sounds like a plan. I'm there and headed for the General Personnel Base's bar." There was a separate officers' bar and mess, which they could have gone to, but it was tradition in the 10 to mix with all ranks. It was, after all, an elite brotherhood, and rank didn't break that bond. Stalker shook Link's hand, and they pulled up a couple of chairs in a quiet corner of the packed bar, which was full of men and women drinking, playing pool, and talking the talk, just like any pub on Earth Stalker thought, minus the uniforms. Stalker spent some time talking to Link, discovering that oddly Zed had already been transferred back to the designated Terra Nova base of operations at FOB Diamond, as had all the other returned Terra Nova members from strike missions. They discussed the events of the mission and toasted to lost comrades, the conversation then moving on theories as to why they both had received orders for rest and relaxation, R&R, at Hellion, and weren't rejoining the Terra Nova straight away like the others. Stalker had just finished his third beer when he got the message from the medical nurse that Zoe was about to be released. Link declined an offer to accompany him, passed on his best, and headed off to challenge an unfortunate supply clerk at pool. Stalker chuckled to himself as he left. If Link played pool like he shot his rifle, he didn't envy the clerk's chances. Zoe emerged from medical right on time. She was dressed in casuals and still sporting a noticeable limp and plastered arm. Stalker threw her a lazy salute. She arched an eyebrow and then, despite herself, laughed. "You know, I don't even know your name? The price of that is dinner." Stalker smiled as she feigned indignation and with a most haughty expression replied that she didn't consort with strange men. "Well, you're in luck. I'm not that strange, and I'm held in high regard by some very important people." Stalker escorted her back to her billet and waited respectfully outside while she showered and organized her kit. They decided to eat in the officer's mess, and over dinner went through the events of the past few days and talked about home. The more time he spent with her, the more Stalker found himself liking her company and forgetting about the war, but the war he knew wouldn't forget about him. The evening seemed to end too fast, and before he knew it, he was back at her quarters. They talked some more, and the time seemed to fly by. Eventually, he rose to leave, Stalker seeing the indecision in her eyes as he did so. Both knew that there was no guarantee that they would see each other again or that they would come through this war unscathed. She reached out suddenly and took his hand. "Stay." Stalker sat back down on her side and didn't leave it again. Pierce had not slept in hours, the passage of time passing unnoticed, his body maintained by a mixture of caffeine and adrenaline, his mind focused solely on the hunt. His search had begun with the SAR teams, and the confirmation that Atlas's remains were not amongst those recovered. Those of his wife already placed into storage for forensic analysis and later transport to her family back on Earth. Pierce would not follow her home. Instead, he had decided to honor her memory and what she had died for by finding and killing the man who had betrayed her and taken her life. Pierce had then accessed the Genesis's sensor logs, which thankfully were not kept on the bridge, but were retained in armored servers deep within the Genesis's superstructure where even Atlas could not gain access to them. They revealed a weak tracking signature of an object breaking away from the debris field shortly after the hull breach. A later inventory of the items recovered from the hangar bay, showing that an orbital stealth transport was missing. Pierce carefully detailed and recorded the information before deleting the records from the ship's database and issuing intelligence branch silence edicts on the few who knew the details. The rarely used edicts, which could be placed on any UEDF member and in some cases UEL citizens, were binding for life under the threat of imprisonment and asset seizure. The tenets being so strong that not even the UEL chairperson had the legal authority to overturn them once they had been issued and signed by the head of the intelligence branch. His suspicions confirmed Pierce used his authority as General De Vere's adjutant and the network of intelligence branch officers and operatives in the UEF to covertly gather sensor data from all ships operating in the area at the time of the hull breach. The collective data revealed that the transport had entered Mars orbit before disappearing. It was not much, but it was a start. The game of Nemesis had begun, and Pierce was determined to see it through. He would find Atlas, if it took a week or a decade. Only one thing remaining unresolved was who would live and who would die. It was still dark when Stalker stirred and quietly left after giving a sleeping Zoe a light kiss on her warm cheek. It would be sunrise in an hour, and Stalker strolled to his billet and changed into PT gear before going for a jog around the base. noting that the pace of activity on base was still at a high tempo, with LTTs, HTTs, and HCTs coming and going continuously. As he jogged, his back and muscles once again resisted, although this time for an entirely different reason. I might be too old for this, but I'm not too old for that yet, Stalker told himself. Lathered in sweat, he hit the showers and then headed to the mess. It was 05:30 and the mess was already busy. Stalker had 1 day left of on-base leave and resolved himself to getting up to speed on ops and getting his kit ready for action. He spent most of the morning at the base armorer fitting, checking and rechecking his replacement EEA before heading down to a firing range that had been set up on the base perimeter and testing his full weapons kit and further testing his EEA. The afternoon was occupied by updating on intel reports and the strategic situation changes of the last 48 hours. News from the front was encouraging by this stage, but Stalker wasn't so sure. Every time they seemed to have the Reds on the run, they had hit back. Virtually all resistance in Cydonia had now been eliminated by the massive inflow of UEDF forces. Unfortunately, most had come from the forward staging areas for the upcoming assault on Hellas, an assault that now would have to be delayed. Also, despite the 1st Mecha Corps and other reserve heavy formations being committed to the battle, they had still largely failed to pin down and destroy the Red Legion's mecha forces, with a large part of it escaping the UEDF counterattack and airstrikes. Other reports spoke of increased suicide and missile attacks on ships in orbit and of guerrilla attacks still occurring across the board. The Red Legion, it seemed, had left light infantry forces behind all over Mars, and they were now appearing at random and were using hit and run tactics, the attacks tying down large numbers of UDF forces. Stalker also saw that scratch units from the battered assault divisions, including the Terra Nova, were being employed on search and destroy missions to ferret out the Reds in the cities and remote areas. Stalker couldn't understand it. Despite the shortage of troops and the rebuilding of the Terra Nova that was underway, he and Link had been ordered to stay at FOB Hellion rather than return with the others to FOB Diamond. Stalker was on the verge of calling Terra Nova Command when he received a message to report to Landing Pad 21A. Stalker walked across the base and noticed that a lot of new forces were pouring in. Most were green troops new to the theater, but there were a few small groups that moved with the confidence and swagger of veterans. As he passed one such group, Stalker noticed they didn't have any visible unit markings, but wore full EEA, the men noting his presence with equal interest. Not that he was hard to miss, still being in his brand new midnight black EEA and bristling with a full weapons loadout. Stalker arrived at Pad 21A and saw that it was occupied by a HTT, which was offloading containers of heavy equipment. There were several people in deep conversation by the HTT. One of them was wearing black EEA bearing Terra Nova insignia. As he got closer, Stalker recognized the man. I don't fucking believe it. D strode up and gripped Stalker's hand with a crushing handshake. You're looking well, Stalker. Heard you had an eventful time on your last op? Stalker instantly felt better being back with his CEO, one of the best soldiers he had ever had the honor of serving with. Stalker and D chatted for a few minutes, Stalker telling D about his last mission, the encounter with the mech, and about Zoe. As they chatted, D enlightened him on why he was at Hellion. It seemed that D had been put on a special assignment after he recovered from the Cydonia action, and it was at his request that Stalker and Link had been reassigned to join him. It was then that Stalker recognized one of the men over D's shoulder. Your taste in company seems to have gone downhill since Cydonia. What the hell's he doing here? D glanced over his shoulder to where Stalker was staring intently. Why don't you ask him? I might just do that. And with that, Stalker strode towards a small group by the HTT, focused on one in particular. Still alive, Pierce? I thought for sure that if the Reds hadn't got you yet, that one of our guys would have. Pierce turned and met Stalker's gaze, and immediately Stalker realized he looked different, tired, strained somehow, like he knew and had seen too much. Nice to see you made it, Unit Commander. Heard you lost a lot of good people at Cydonia. I also heard that you did good work there. Stalker searched the words and voice for any trace of smugness or arrogance, but found none. He seemed a different man to the one he had met previously. Something had changed in him. He had lost something. It was something that Stalker had seen and experienced himself. Personal loss. Pierce held him with a steady gaze. After a moment, Stalker decided to change tact. "So, I gather you don't have us here for the pleasure of my company? No bullshit on this one. It's important. Briefing is at 2100 at the Raptor CP. D will fill you in with any details you require beforehand." Stalker felt D's hand gently grip his shoulder. "Common, we've got a lot catching up to do." As they walked away from the HTT, Stalker realized something and turned to D confused. "There is no Raptor's presence on this base." D just grinned. "By 2100, there will be." For the next few hours, D brought Stalker and Link up to speed on the planned special operation. Hellas was a massive mining complex that was built very early on in the terraforming of Mars, and as a result was almost exclusively constructed underground for protection against the ferocious storms that Mars used to suffer. These early settlements have been further expanded by hundreds of years of mining, and now included thousands of kilometers of tunnels and hundreds of individual but interlinked subterranean settlements. On top of this, the majority of the complexes and tunnels were deep within a mountain range that dwarfed anything found on Earth. It had been there that the best deposits of valuable minerals and metals had been discovered. It was a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare, made even more so by a deep sea of shifting dunes at the base of the mountains that made an armored ground assault that much more difficult. Their objective, however, was not to conduct a frontal attack. That task would fall to other, much larger UEDF elements. Stalker didn't envy the commander with that job. Instead, Stalker and Link would join D and a sizable number of other veteran soldiers from the assault divisions to attack and seize a landing platform. The platform was situated in a relatively quiet part of the mountain range, far from where the main hammer blow was destined to fall. The target consisted of a series of individual landing pads that together formed a larger platform. The pads were serviced by hangars built into the side of the mountain that were equipped with massive cargo elevators, which descended down into 3 large transit hubs. These, however, were not the designated route of advance, as Intel expected them to be out of commission to deter just such an attack. Instead, their path was to be the much smaller and easily defended access and service tunnels that ran between the hangars and the transit hubs deeper within the mountain. Once the hubs were seized, the team would set up a blocking position to cut off all traffic to and from the tunnels that led to the hubs, while other teams would push deeper to a series of much larger complexes further in and seize or destroy them. Seize or destroy. Were these complexes exactly? For the first time since he had been chatting to him, D looked uncomfortable. "I have no idea. Very much need to know stuff. All I know is that it's vital we take and hold them, and if we can't, destroy them." "You trust Pierce and those backstabbing bastards at Intelligence Branch?" "Of course not. Why do you think I insisted that you and Link come along for the ride? I'm not going in there alone with those arseholes." Stalker laughed out loud. D suddenly turned serious. "I do think, however, that this mission must be important. A lot of assault boys have been called in to assist. Whatever it is, it's vital. So, at least we will be fighting in good company then." D just nodded. Link smiled. "Don't worry. If those Pathfinders don't play nice, there could be a sudden cave-in. Those Reds are always playing around with demo charges. Be easy for one to suddenly go off." That brought another burst of laughter. Stalker left D and Link, who were busily engaged in telling ever taller stories about fishing, and dropped in on Zoe, who, despite still having her flight status revoked due to injury, was in one of the hangars in a simulator doing her post-mission debrief. Stalker stood in the command room with the senior tech, who seemed more than a little intimidated to have the tall, black-armored figure standing over him. Stalker watched the mission footage on the screen as Zoe piloted her LTTS just over the dark floor of a valley at breakneck speed. Even with his untrained eyes, Stalker could see she was good and had a natural pilot daring. Stalker saw on the display the track that she was following, that the simulation was based on the data from her crashed aircraft's flight path telemetry recorder. The after-incident debriefs were conducted to exonerate or prove pilot error and to diagnose the reasons for a crash. It also allowed the pilot to learn from the incident, and the simulations were also used to train new pilots in actual combat situations. Stalker saw the tech's only data on the screen. One of the data streams was a countdown until the moment of the crash, and time was running out. Within a few minutes, warning lights flashed up on Zoe's HUD. Engine 1 was showing a vibration warning. Zoe reduced power, but seconds later, without warning, the cowling around the starboard engine disintegrated, sending shrapnel tearing through the tail control surfaces and pitching the LTT violently to the right. In a split second, using her stick-mounted engine pitch and power controls, Zoe reversed power to the opposite engine, desperately struggling to keep her crippled aircraft in the air. Just like the night that she crashed, however, her efforts proved fruitless, and the LTTS spiraled into the valley floor, the simulator going dark. Stalker strode down to the simulator platform as Zoe emerged. Pulling off her flight helmet, she was drenched in sweat. Zoe didn't seem to see Stalker and instead directed her attention to the tech and another pilot bearing wing leader insignia, who was also on the platform. Stalker just stood aside and, feeling a little awkward, observed as Zoe discussed the flight with the others. Stalker, despite all his experience, was soon lost in all the discussions over azimuths, trim, flight surfaces, and the technical specifications of the LTT's RD-75 tilt rotor engines. As they moved to the command console to take a more detailed look at the flight data, Zoe paused by Stalker. "Good afternoon, Unit Commander, Pilot Officer Lassiter." Stalker returned the now familiar mock formal greeting. "I hope you're not stalking me." Zoe putting extra emphasis on the stalking part. Stalker smiled. "Actually, I just wanted a quiet word if you can spare me a few minutes." Zoe waved off the others, and they moved on to the control room, leaving them alone on the platform. Before he could speak, Zoe cut him off. "I just have one question for you first. Was last night a passing thing for you?" Stalker looked at Zoe. She stood a full foot below him. Her jaw was set, her blue eyes clear and bright. She was both headstrong and proud. "No." It was all he could say as he grappled for words under her scrutiny. Her expression shifted slightly, never breaking eye contact. "Good. Now what did you want to say?" "There's no easy way to say this. There's an op coming up. It's a big one. I only just found out a short while ago. I will try to see you soon, but things are going to get very busy around here, and I could be deployed at any moment." She just stared blankly at him. "So soon? You're barely recovered from your injuries. I thought you might be around for a little while before going off to win the war single-handed." "I know, we haven't had the best timing, but when this is over I'll make the time. You have my word." They stood there staring at each other, unspoken words passing between them. Zoe speaking first. "I should go, they're waiting." As Zoe began to turn away, Stalker made a snap decision and reached out, grasping her hand. It felt tiny in his armored fist. He drew her to him. She didn't resist, and kissed her, not caring about who saw. As he held her in his arms, their lips came apart, and he spoke softly into her ear. "Stay safe, Miss Lassiter. After all this is over, I'll find you, and no angel of heaven or demon of hell will stop me." Then he turned on his heel and strode away, not daring to look back. The forlorn figure of Zoe, alone on the walkway, watching him go. At 2045 hours local time, Stalker, D, and Link walked into a heavily guarded hangar at the far end of the base. There were quite a few soldiers already inside. Stalker guessed over 250. At the far end was a cluster of senior officers gathered around a pair of large tactical display screens. Stalker and the others looked around curiously at the soldiers in the hangar. They were split into small groups, and the hangar echoed with their voices. Stalker saw Praetorians, Excaliburs, Vikings, Crusaders, Immortals, and Philistines, several faces turning their way and returning their scrutiny. Stalker also noted a small number of blood-red colored assault troops clustered around a giant of a man who stood taller than everyone else in the hangar. They were from the Barbarians, another of the 10. Their blood-red EEA suits were covered in stylized scenes of battle etched into their EEA's ceramic composite plates, each scene representing a proud moment in their long history. Written down the plate sections on their arms and ending across their fists was a collection of phrases in some near-forgotten language. Without even seeing it up close, Stalker knew what the words said. The barbarians are at the gates. There were also a few dozen Terra Nova members in the hangar, and the 3 new arrivals made a beeline for them, and before long they were deep in conversation. The chatter was cut short a few minutes later as a voice boomed out to call them to attention before the officers. An officer stepped forward and handed his long, heavy coat to an aide. Stalker and everyone else in the hangar took a slight step back in shock as the man's face was revealed. Although almost none of them had ever seen or met the officer before, they all knew who he was. The lean, hard face and slate-gray eyes as hard as granite were unmistakable. His name was General de Veers, and he was the head of the intelligence branch, and perhaps the most powerful man in the entire UEL. What the fuck? Stalker was truly amazed. De Veers was the last man he had expected to see at the gathering. What has Deke got me into? De Veers' voice cut clearly across the now silent hangar as he started his briefing. Stand easy, gentlemen. This war has gone on long enough, and the time has come to end it. All of you here are going to play a vital part in securing that final victory. Things are not going as well as many of you may believe. You all know of the ferocity of the enemy defense and their endless delaying tactics. These tactics have also been equally applied in space, and Earth has paid a heavy price. One of these attacks is the reason you are here. The forces originally designated for this attack were by chance intercepted and their transports shot down. As a result, we have had to call upon your help to aid our remaining Pathfinders in this attack. You are amongst the best that Earth and your proud divisions have to offer, and I have no doubt that you will prove worthy of this great challenge. De Veers handed over to a tactical officer who went through the target area in detail with the aid of schematics and reconnaissance images. The plan in a nutshell was shock and awe. They were to seize the landing platform and then as quickly as possible assault and take the lower levels, relying on speed and surprise for success. This operation will be timed to start 5 hours after 3 UEA Corps begin probing the primary Red Legion defenses some 60 clicks to the south of your target area. This will be the first of 2 distractions which will pin down and distract as many enemy forces as possible. To explain the second, I'll hand over to Assault Commander Spears. A Raptor's Assault Commander stepped forward. He was in full EEA, colored in the Raptor's distinctive sky blue, and was the very image of the dashingly handsome soldier. The divisional motto of Strike Swiftly proudly emblazoned in silver script across his chest plate. The words grasped in the talons of a fierce-looking eagle with its wings outstretched and swooping down. 2 neighboring platforms which join into adjacent tunnel systems have been identified as occupied by strong Red Legion forces. The Reds have also in recent weeks established a sizable resupply and artillery firebase at the base of the mountain range within 12 clicks of the target platform. The Raptors will destroy these forces and gain tactical control of the surrounding area. A Philistin raised his hand. Do we know the strength of the enemy formations? There are estimated to be several hundred Reds occupying the platforms and 2,000 to 3,000 occupying the base. But these numbers are variable as enemy units move in and out once supplied and refitted. What strength will you deploy? We are deploying the whole division in a single Hail Mary attack. That brought a murmur rippling through the hangar. A Hail Mary was the nickname given by the assault forces to a DOA, or Divisional Orbital Assault, also referred to cynically as dead on arrival by some. It was a tactic the assault divisions trained for, but rarely, if ever, used operationally. Typically, the assault divisions were deployed piecemeal, or if en masse without their heavier support equipment, as the Terra Nova had done at Tharsis. Deploying the entire division and all its equipment meant that they intended to stay regardless of the circumstances. It also compounded the risks, as once deployed, the heavy equipment could not easily be extracted. Indeed, bringing invulnerable heavy transport ships in a combat situation would be next to impossible. The Raptors would land with all their vehicles, striders, command elements, portable maintenance facilities, and paraphernalia that the assault division required to support and sustain itself for several days, or even weeks, without resupply. That was assuming, of course, that a large amount of the division's equipment wasn't destroyed in the drop, but for better or worse, in a DOA operation, the entire division would be combat deployed to the surface. Stalker remembered reading an after-action report from a Crusaders simulated DOA into a heavily defended position. In the exercise, the pretend enemy, 4,000 men from the Philistines deliberately targeted the larger vehicle and supply pods. The result was that despite achieving a tactical victory, if the action had been real, the Crusaders would have been gutted, losing 45% strength in men and almost 60% in vehicles and equipment. It was a sobering thought. Stalker could see that Link was standing a little straighter as he digested the information, and after a moment the hangar again fell silent as the briefing continued. The ground attack was scheduled to begin in a week's time due to the need to wait until the UEA could redeploy sufficient equipment back to the Hellas Theater of Operations. In the intervening period, they would be moved up to a FOB near the area of operations where they would train and refine their plan of attack. From there, they would make a roundabout trip using HTTs to a point where they could assault the target platform directly. The trip to the rear of the objective would be screened by escorting gunships, jamming drones, diversionary airstrikes, and hit-and-run raids in all sectors to deceive the enemy of their movements. They would then attack at first light with the sun behind them, 300 assault veterans along with 300 pathfinders, and if all went well, they would seize the upper levels almost immediately before pressing on into the lower levels. General de Veers stepped forward at the end of the briefing. "Are there any further questions?" As he began to turn away, a gruff voice boomed out. "Well, that's enough of the bullshit. What's our real objective, General? Exactly what type of facilities are they?" General de Veers turned back to face the speaker, and Stalker thought he saw him flush a little. "Battle Commander Kalen, you have all the information you require. You were a bad liar in the Academy, de Veers, and I see you haven't improved much. Would have thought you would have gotten a little better now that you're Spookmaster General." Stalker craned slightly to see who the speaker was. As it turned out, he wasn't hard to miss. It was the imposingly tall barbarian he had seen earlier. De Veers just glared at the smirking bear of a man in his bright red armor before turning and walking away, his aides scrambling to catch up, laughter following him from Kalen and his surrounding barbarians. "No love lost there." Stalker nodded in agreement to Dee's comment. No love indeed. Shortly after they were issued their dispatch orders, and the briefing broke up. The assault troops, however, stayed and talked amongst themselves, the banter and laughter lasting late into the Martian night. Stalker woke up early and got in his routine base jog, ironing out the kinks in his muscles, the run giving him precious time to himself to think. Once his jog was over, he set about running an inventory of his kit and packing it up. He was nearly done when Dee and Link dropped by carrying their kit. "Time to go." Stalker regretted not having time to see Zoe again before he left, but promised himself he would send her a message once he was settled in at the FOB. When they arrived at the designated pad, they found it occupied by a cargo HTT and 22 other assault troops already waiting. Stalker recognized some of them from the previous night's briefing, including the imposing figure of Battle Commander Kalen. Stalker looked around. Including them, there were 25 men boarding the HTT. That couldn't be a coincidence, he thought. They were a mixed bunch. Only 2 of the 10 were not represented on the transport, the Raptors and the Rangers. Stalker considered it. The Raptors were fresh to Mars and were fully committed to the DOA, while as far as he knew, the Rangers, with their new adaptable splinter camouflage, had played no part in the Martian campaign. As the HTT began to lift off, the men greeted and got to know each other, and by the end of the 12-hour flight, they were all well acquainted. Despite some healthy competition, all members of the 10 regarded their fellow assault troops as friends and trusted them more than other members of the UEDF. It had been a pleasant enough flight, Stalker thought, as the HTT came to rest at their new FOB designated Dragon. He had even managed to get a few more hours of precious sleep. As they came off, they were greeted by an intel officer who directed them to a mess hall. It was already occupied. As they filed in and dumped their gear, 25 Pathfinders watched them with silent curiosity. Stalker recognized Pierce amongst them. "Well, if it isn't my #1 guy." Stalker remembered from a briefing that the forces would be split into 50-man strong strike teams composed of half assault troops and half Pathfinders. Each strike team would have a different objective once they took the platforms and hangars. Some would set up blocking positions, while most would advance deeper and seize or destroy the objectives. Objectives? What a joke, Stalker mused as he looked at the Pathfinders. They didn't even know what the objectives were. The two groups stood watching each other like oil and water, refusing to mix. Then something interesting happened. Pierce walked up to Stalker and held out his hand, Stalker taking it on reflex. "Welcome to FOB Dragon. It's good to see a familiar face. Seems like we're going to be working together again. It's always an honor to work with the warriors of the Ten." To say Stalker was taken aback was an understatement, and before he could reply, Pierce greeted D, and the ice broke, the two groups merging. The soldiers greeting one another, the wisecracks and banter starting in earnest. Over the next few days, the men got to know each other well as they trained as a unit and with the other teams. Grudgingly, Stalker had to concede that the Pathfinders were good. Many had once been assault troops and part of the Ten, and it didn't take long, and they were moving together smoothly as a unit. They had round-table discussions about tactics, and many of the men seemed to genuinely become friends. It amazed Stalker, the sheer amount of experience and professionalism that had been gathered for this one operation was formidable. Kalen and some of the others rivaled even D in knowledge, and a healthy competition between the men honed their already considerable skills to a keen edge. They trained and retrained in close-quarters combat, firing on the move as a unit, marksmanship, explosives, and, as the time of the operation approached, they could predict each other's movements, and more importantly trusted the man next to them. Stalker also found time to send a quick comm message to Zoe. All it said was to Pilot Officer Lassiter, "Stay safe, I will see you on the flip side." As the day of the mission, approach gear was checked and rechecked, intel and orbital imagery gone over and then gone over again, until every man could draw the layout of the platform and tunnel networks from memory. So far, the intel on their target platforms was good. They were in regular use with transports coming and going, and there were no visible heavy weapons defending the platforms, just a few scratch infantry positions. The platform was actually 4 interlinked landing pads serviced by several hangars. It was estimated that there were between 200 and 300 enemy soldiers manning them all told. The mission plan calling for them to be suppressed by the escorting gunships as the strike force landed. The attack depended largely on coordination with the diversionary raids, and more critically, the Raptors' DOA. The assaulting forces HTTs had to arrive just before the DOA took place. Too early, and they would risk the nearby forces intervening. Too late, and they would have to attack an alerted position through a raging battle zone. As the time to the operation began to run out, everyone busied themselves with their final loadouts. Weapons were stripped and tested, electronic diagnostics run, and the base armory was pillaged for ammunition and grenades of all types. Stalker's 50-man team was designated Target Sierra 6, a large cavern several levels down. It was also the target that was the farthest from the initial landing platform. Stalker had looked at the plans dozens of times over the last week, and he knew it backwards, and no matter how he looked at it, he saw any of a dozen potential problems with the route to their ultimate objective. As Stalker looked at the schematics for the 100th time, he remembered the words of one of his early instructors when he had first entered the UEDF. "No attack is easy, no attack is clean. Work with what you have and know, not what you want or imagine." Stalker had lived and fought by those words. As he ran his hands through his hair, Stalker let his thoughts wander. He had received a reply from Zoe. All it had said was, "Unit Commander, you made me a promise, and as a member of the Terra Nova, I expect you to keep your word. Stay safe and good hunting." He had smiled at that. She knew the honor code of the Terra Nova and the Ten. She knew that once he had given his word, he was honor-bound to fulfill it, and that was one promise he looked forward to keeping.